Good afternoon. So my dissertation project is kind of a reflection of about 7 years of research on this particular topic. So to kind of describe what I did, this project involved creating a method book for performing quarter tonal music on the trombone. So I kind of want to give you an introduction into what am I talking about when I use the word quarter tone, okay? And there are 3 definitions, or 3 ways to talk about the definition of quarter tones. And the first one is going to involve discussing sense, in terms of intonation sense. So, as most of you probably heard, we have the semitone, which is 100 cents. And so that has that distinct spacing intervallically, okay? If we multiply that 100 cents by 2, we get what we call the whole tone, which is 200 cents. Now, so we have whole tone, semitone, or half tone. So quarter tone, therefore, will take that 200 cents and divide it by 4. And therefore, if we do the math, you'll see, in addition to a little funky accidental there in front of the second note, you'll see that we have 200 cents divided by 4, or a distance of 50 cents, which sounds something like this. Which, the joy of MIDI files being what they are, we have a lovely little pitch wheel bend effect happening there. Now, if we'd like to compare the whole tone, semitone, and quarter tone together to hear the intervals getting narrower and wider, it sounds like this. This audio file is going to start with a whole tone, then a semitone, and a quarter tone, and then work its way back out. If the mouse will here. So it has a very unique quality, and oftentimes when I talk with people about quarter tones, the initial reaction I get is something to the effect of, you know, I have really young students that play those anyway, especially on the trombone. Because, you know, young students' ears are still developing, they're still getting a kinesthetic sense of where they're supposed to go with the slide position. And so oftentimes their buzzing and their slide positions kind of land in the cracks, if you will, in terms of not really an approximation of the semitone and the whole tone, but something sort of like this. Another way that we can talk about quarter tonal music, and is actually the way in which quarter tonal music started becoming popular in the 20th century, is through systems that are called EDO systems. EDO stands for equal division of the octave, okay? So let's say that we have an octave from, in this case, B flat to D flat. And we divide that octave into 12 equal pitches, equidistantly from one another. That is our standard chromatic scale. So as we talked about in the previous slide, we have all these semitones here because the chromatic scale is simply ascending half steps, semitones. So we have 100 cents here, 100 cents here, and so on and so forth. That is the system in which Western music has operated primarily for about the past 4 to 5 centuries exclusively. If we were to change that, however, and divide the octave only into 6 equal parts, we'd still get pitches that are very comfortable to us, because basically it would just be every other pitch of the chromatic scale. Or as we like to call this particular scale, the whole tone scale, because the distance between each of these notes is a whole tone, 200 cents. Now, just kind of like we did with the previous slide, if we work our way, instead of dividing by 2, instead multiply by 2, we get what's called a 24 EDO system, which is dividing the octave into 24 equal parts. Hence, which gives us this lovely little figure, which is the chromatic scale via quarter tones. And you'll notice that there are several, again, interesting symbols here that I'll gladly discuss in a little bit. But this is another way in which composers have really expanded their microtonal horizons. This This is actually probably one of the more accessible new EDO systems. I've talked with composers who compose in EDO systems of 17, 19, 31, 95, 123. And basically all they're doing is they're taking the octave, dividing it into that many equal parts, and then writing pieces using the frequencies generated from that. A third way that we can talk about quarter tones, and is actually probably the most accessible way in terms of talking about how we're going to play this on the trombone, is the idea of quarter tones being a midpoint. So we have, and again, I'm bringing this example, we have this G, and right next to it, I'm putting next to it in quotation marks for this context, we have a lovely A flat, and we've talked about that as a distance of 100 cents. However, if we are to insert a note that splits that 100 cents down the middle, 50 and 50, that pitch right there is the quarter tone that exists between the G and the A flat. Okay? So those are three different ways that we can talk about defining what these pitches are. So now that I've given you a little bit of an introduction to what they are, another thing that I should talk about in terms of this project that I kind of embarked on is one area of my research is on the idea of how these pitches are notated. And as I mentioned, we have some unique new symbols that are meant to kind of convey from the composer, I want you to play quarter tonal pitches here. The problem with this is that this notation that you see here is one of a multitude of possibilities that you can see for quarter tonal music. This is an example of modifying accidentals that already exist to kind of highlight what the composer's intent is. But you could see arrows in front of notes that point up and down and say, hey, play this pitch, but then lower it or raise it 50 cents. You could see accidentals that don't look anything like the accidentals we know. And sometimes the composers won't even necessarily explain in the music what they're looking for with these particular accidentals. You just have to kind of know the composer's style and understand what it is that he or she is going for. And so when writing this book, one of the conundrums I guess I had is, how do I go about, do I use a ton of different notation systems throughout the book, or do I just stick with one and just go with it? And my idea in the end was, well, let's just stick with one system in terms of learning how to play these pitches. And then there are resources provided in the end which list other books and other materials that explain these various accidental systems. Another interesting aspect about this is that even the same composer could use different notational systems in different pieces for quarter tones. So there's even inconsistency among composers themselves writing their own works. Another interesting thing about this is that if you use Sibelius software, these are pretty much the accidentals that Sibelius will use. Now I'm a Finale user. I had to kind of trick Finale into doing quarter tone accidentals, creating quarter tone MIDI files. There's a way that we can do that, but we just don't have that kind of time to talk about that. So, in terms of the crux of the book, when I first proposed this idea to my committee, one of my committee members said to me, I don't really understand why you're doing a method book for trombone and quarter tone music, because the trombone is one of the easiest instruments to do quarter tones on. It should just be a matter of playing in between slide positions. And what I had to explain is that it's not just enough to know the technique. You also have to know the context in which these rather foreign pitches appear. And here's an example of why. So, you may remember reading this poem in a high school or college English class. This is Lewis Carroll's Jabberwocky. And at first glance, there is a whole lot of nonsense in this poem. Words that we've never seen before, we have no idea what they mean. It's just we can't process what exactly is being discussed in this poem. For all we know, this could be about a trip to the grocery store or something. And so, because of the initial confusion regarding, words, Borgo, what is that, Minzy, and all this good stuff, we are, at first glance, accustomed to just dismissing this as being something, worthless or inaccessible. However, once we start to look at the big picture of the poem, we realize that this is the story about a young man who's out to kill a very dangerous creature. And while we may not understand every single word in the poem, we can appreciate the big picture of the poem for its uniqueness and the way in which it manages to tell the story without us understanding everything that's going on. And this is kind of how I relate pretty much all microtonal music, is that there are a plethora of pitches, frequencies, that sort of thing, that are just very foreign to our ear. We're not accustomed to hearing them, myself included. However, if we can understand the context in which this music is being presented to us, we can better appreciate it for the big picture, for what the music is trying to convey. And so in my research, I have come up with what I call are the 5 purposes of microtones. And what is interesting to me about this particular aspect of my research is that I have talked with many microtonal composers, and their reaction to this is, why are you trying to put my music in a box? Why are you trying, I'm just trying to express my language. And my response to them is that that's all great that you want to express your language, but if we also want people to be able to understand it. For me personally, this is a music that I would like to see gain more momentum and more performance. And in order for that to happen, we have to educate both performers and audiences in terms of how this music plays out, what exactly is going on with it. And so I've defined 5 pretty big categories that I found for use of not just quarter tones, but all microtonal pitches. Those are, as you can see up here, ornamentation, simulation of non-Western music systems, both expanded tonality and expanded atonality, and also usage of microtones within jazz improvisation. And so I'm going to talk briefly about all these purposes, because this is essentially, once you get past the introductory about 5 or 6 pages of my book, this is what the rest of it is now we're going to take these pitches, we're practicing them, and now we want you to put them in context so that this music becomes more accessible when you perform it for audiences. And it also becomes more accessible to you as the player, which makes it more enjoyable, more likely. So the first context I'd like to talk about is ornamentation. And I have 2 examples here. This first example is a very blown up excerpt from the trombone part to John Mackey's Red Line Tango. This bar contains, as you can see, glissandos in all 3 beats. And Mackey utilizes, if you look at this accidental and this accidental right here, he's asking for quarter tonal pitches as a guide mark, if you will, for the glissandi. Now, at first glance, it might be easy just to say, okay, well, they're in glissandi, so it doesn't matter. But what's very interesting about this particular context is if you look, he also asks for a crescendo through the glissando mark. So he's indicating that the end point of the glissando at this particular rather loud moment, he wants that to be distinguished. He wants that to be heard. This down here is an exercise that appears in one of the first pages of my book, and is an embellishment, if you will, of a song that is very near and dear to most people in this room's hearts, and that would be the MSU fight song. So that appears in the book. It's my little Easter egg. If you ever find it and it gets published, you can say, hey, on page 6, the MSU fight song is embellished in quarter tones. Isn't that lovely? Basically, what we're talking about with ornamentation, then, is the idea that these pitches are occurring very infrequently in a context that is pretty much 12 EDO, if you will. And otherwise, most of the time, using notes of the chromatic scale. But then occasionally, we get these pitches that kind of act as the in-betweens, the passing tones, the neighbor tones, if you will, that are kind of used to just spice up the chromatic lines, if you will. One fancy word that's used to describe this is what's called ultrachromaticism. In other words, chromaticism beyond the chromatic pitches that we're used to. It's ultra, not super, it's ultra. So there's a difference. So right, this idea of just kind of an effect, if you will, rather than being a very strong presence in a piece. Another example of quarter-tonal ornamentation is in the second movement of the Barney Child Sonata for Unaccompanied Trombone, in which Barney Child specifically asks the performer to play in what's called half positions, which are, as you can see here, half positions, as I've notated them, as being, in this case, 2.5, 1.5. So basically what we're talking about are locations on the slide that are essentially halfway in between. So the first 5 notes of this particular exercise going up in half positions. So just working our way up half position-wise. This is, again, one of the reasons why the trombone is one of the, I guess, easier instruments, sort of, if you will, to learn this, because it really just involves you practicing the in-betweens. Now that being said, there are a multitude of locations in between third and second position. So you can't just pick a random one, park it, and call it good, okay? Well, no matter what instrument you're practicing quarter tones on, this little device, a tuner, is essential. And what your goal should be, those trombonists up there interested in practicing this, see me afterwards if you are, by the way, is your goal should be to get it so that the tuner cannot tell what pitch you're trying to play. Because if you get the tuner to register 50 cents sharp or flat, it's going to scream, I have no idea what you're doing. Okay? And when that happens, you should be smiling after you take the instrument away from your face. Because it means that you have achieved finding these quarter-tonal pitches, and you can throw yourself a little party. Another thing, too, to kind of point out by the star notes here, is that because we have these quarter-tone accidentals, we can also have enharmonic spellings. So just as E flat and D sharp we understand to be the same pitch, these two notes we can understand to be the same pitch, just they're enharmonically spelled differently. Okay? Alright, so the first thing I'm going to play extensively for you are the first etudes that appear in the book, those that are beyond the introductory half position exercises and that sort of thing. And basically, what I have here are 4 etudes that I wrote to kind of practice this idea of the passing and neighbor tone ornamentation, if you will. Just to kind of highlight a couple things in these before I play them. So here we have our first instance of spicing up that chromatic line, if you will. So we have 2 passing tones between the pitches of the scale as opposed to 1. Another extended chromatic pattern here and here. Same thing here. Again, most of these are just passing tones. So down here we have a little bit of double neighbor action, if you will, in which we have these intervals growing smaller and smaller and that sort of thing. So I'm just going to play through these real quick, just so you can kind of hear how the ornamentation is playing out in these exercises. diatonic melodies going on throughout most of each of the etudes, but you also have a little bit of chromaticism, and then on the third level you have the ultrachromaticism where the quarter tones start to show up. So that's the idea of quarter tones in an ornamentation context. So the next thing that I'd like to talk about is the idea of simulating non-Western music systems. And this is actually a very important context to discuss because this composer was the first, I put first in quotation marks, to propose the 24 EDO system as a compositional technique. And he did that because Arabic scales and Arabic music are based in a 24 EDO system. And so I have two scales here. These are called maqam scales. These are used mainly throughout the Middle East and Egypt. And if you notice, they are constructed very similarly to our Western major and minor scales. But we see this occasional unique accidental. This right here is very close to a C major scale. The only difference is we've lowered the third and the seventh scale degree by a quarter tone. Okay. Another thing on here that I've got is a sample of the audio tracks that go along with the CD that I've included with this book. There are about 30 tracks, and mainly it's just a MIDI file of trombone sound playing along with whoever's using the book. But the way that a lot of the scale exercises work is something I actually borrowed from a book by David Schwartz called Breakfast, in which the first thing that happens is the MIDI file plays the scale along with the performer. And then the metronome will click again, and it will simply drone the bottom note of the scale. And so whoever is playing this can check intonation against that particular drone. So I'm just going to play a little bit. This is a sample audio track from the CD. I was doing some research about 4 or 5 months ago on etudes in Arabic music systems, seeing if I could find one that I could adapt for my book. And I stumbled upon a dissertation completed in 2012 by a DMA trombone student at the University of Ottawa, who basically, his entire dissertation project was on getting the trombone to perform Arabic music. And at first I thought, that's great. And then I thought, uh-oh. So has someone already basically done all the quarter tone stuff that I've been doing? And what's really great about this is it really sums up playing this music in any system of Arabic music. But in terms of quarter tone usage, that's strictly what it's talking about. So the other purposes that we're going to talk about later on in the presentation don't really get addressed. But he has an extensive list of etude and solo material for playing the trombone in Arabic music systems. So this particular piece, which is listed in your program, uses this first scale, the Ras scale. And so you're going to hear this E quarter tone flat and B quarter tone flat. The second half, however, you'll start to hear some inflections that are associated with Arabic music as we know it in terms of our standard system. So you'll start to hear things that sound like intervals within a harmonic minor scale and that sort of thing before we return to this particular scale pattern. microtones can be used to explore the ragas of India or the Slendro-Pelog scales of the gamelan ensembles of Indonesia. So the possibilities are endless. And sometimes, as connoisseurs of Western music, other world music systems are akin to look at us and talk about how we're limiting ourselves by our inability to expand beyond the pitches that we've been set in stone in for centuries. The next thing I'd like to talk about is this notion of expanded tonality. And I want to take you back to those of you who've taken music theory, how you talked about in your freshman theory courses about how major and minor scales are constructed using patterns of whole steps and half steps, and then based on how that scale plays out, then we get a key signature, and that gives us a key, and that's tonality and yang. So expanded tonality, now we have, beyond just whole steps and half steps, now we get an entire new set of intervals and pitches to play around with that we can use to create new scales, new keys, and new harmonies. And what's very interesting about this particular context is that for the composers that use this, for them, these are keys to them. There's a hierarchy of pitches built around a particular note or a particular harmony. And some of the composers that have used these, the Russian composer Ivan Vishnegretsky, Don Ellis, and a more familiar name to some of your eyes would be Charles Ives, who actually had a class taught on him this semester. And so, one of the suggestions that was made is, why don't you use this idea of creating major and minor scales using quarter tones as part of your book in terms of helping people to develop their ear? And I thought, that sounds like a good idea. Let's go with it. Okay? So basically, what we have here is this lovely little excerpt from the Ottman sight singing melody book. And I'm just going to play this for you real quick here, and then we'll talk about how we're going to use this in a particular context that'll help us develop our ears to play these quarter tones. That are very familiar and can lay in our ear very easily, and then put them in a context that we kind of have to struggle with a little bit, but once we get it, we can always check with our ear whether or not we're actually achieving these pitches. So, in terms of new scales that we can get, So this is the basic scale that Ivan Vishnegradsky proposed for his quarter tonal music. And so we have J.S. Bach, who composed the Well-Tempered Clavier and wrote these pieces for all the major and minor keys that the piano could play in. Vishnegradsky composed his 24 preludes. And basically, it's this scale pattern, and then we're just starting one on each note of the quarter tone chromatic scale. Now, remember how we talked about earlier that major and minor scales are patterns of whole steps and half steps. Well, here in this scale, if you'll notice, we have patterns, we have all half steps up here until we get to here, and then we get a quarter step. And then we're just half step, half step, half step, half step, half step, quarter step. So we've basically taken whole, half, whole, and we just made it sound half, 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 quarter, half, 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 quarter. And it kind of has, again, sampling from the CD, so you hear the lovely metronome click to start. To the fact that he actually invented a 4-valve trumpet that can play quarter tones very easily. So basically, whatever note that you're playing with the first 3 valves, you just push the 4th valve down, and it gives you a quarter tone below whatever note you're playing the first 3 valves. And so his method book is constructed in such a way to have people practice on that particular instrument. Though how he expected anyone to acquire said instrument is beyond me, but they are out there. So this is what he calls his basic scale. And what he does is he actually constructs, he has constructed anyway, a multitude of scales by selecting somewhere between usually 7 and 9 pitches of this particular scale from octave to octave. But this he calls his basic scale from which all his other scalar systems extend. I'm going to talk a little bit later about how this scale plays out in terms of his own jazz improvisation, but for now, let's just have a listen to it. The next composer that we're going to talk about, probably the most widely listened to of the 3 composers I listed, is Charles Ives. And in one of his writings, he talked about how if he were to create a new tonal system based on quarter tones, he would construct it in a way that he would have these particular chords as being the foundation of that system. If you notice, I put slash major slash minor, and he has indicated that labeling works as well, because these are terms that we associate in terms of having a primary and secondary function in tonality. So we have a lovely major triad, a minor triad, and those we understand to be the basic harmonic building blocks of our Western music system. He, on the other hand, has proposed these particular chords, which if we break these down via arpeggios, you'll see that in the primary chord, we have two perfect fifths. Here from C to G, and then here E 3/4 flat to B 3/4 flat. And then same thing going on all the way down. And then over here in the minor, we actually have 5 notes in the chord. And notice we can't call it a triad for a variety of reasons. There are 3 notes, and it's hard to argue that it's built on thirds of some kind. It sort of is, but only if you work some harmonic spellings in there. But these are the building blocks, basically, of the few experimentations that Charles Ives has done with quarter tonal music. Now, in the book, because I created all my MIDI files from Finale, one interesting little tidbit you should know if you ever want to delve into this on your own time in notation software, is that Finale and Sibelius have a very difficult time playing quarter tonal pitches and non-quarter tonal pitches at the same time. Even if you try and trick it by putting it in a different layer or something, it can't work. Now, you can probably synthesize something if you want to go as far as exporting to GarageBand, but basically I just kind of said, well, I'll work with what I've got with Finale. And so what I've done for the method book is the audio samples for these are basically arpeggiations of the 2 chords. So I'm going to play through those real quick for you. Here's the primary arpeggio. To get Finale or Sibelius to get these harmonies to sound, I thought, well, I have some friends in the brass area here, and I'm sure they would be enthralled by the prospect of experimenting a little bit, playing music, pitches, systems, anything that they're just not really accustomed to. And so one of these side projects, rather unrelated to the book itself that I did, is a transcription of Charles Ives' quarter tone chorale. This is actually the 3rd movement of a 3-movement work he did for 2 pianos tuned a quarter step apart. But in many of his writings, he indicated that he really wanted this written for a string orchestra, because strings can sustain pitches much better than a piano can. And the way that strings vibrate allows for more resonance for the harmonies that he was going for. And so I thought, oh, that's all fine and dandy. But I have brass players that can sustain and make this work. And so I took it upon myself, for what it's worth, to transcribe the reconstructed string orchestra piece for the brass ensemble you see before you. Now, the method book is for these 3 up here, playing the trombone. So basically, the book is something that they have been looking at the entire year and have been excellent test subjects in terms of giving me feedback regarding, this doesn't make any sense at all, or, hey, I actually kind of like that you used the MSU fight song in this, and that sort of thing. So I am very grateful to them for that. But then when it came time to put it together in a larger ensemble, they kind of became the foundation pitch-wise to make the rest of this work. Because the rest of the instruments on the stage don't have long slides that they can use to just make the in-between pitches work. They have to use their tuning slides, they have to do lip bends, horns, they have to move around with their hands. It can be a bit of a workout. And they've really gone with me on it. We actually premiered this transcription at our final Brass Choir concert of the year 2 days ago. And the reactions from the audience were about as varied as I expected them to be. And so this chorale, as I mentioned, is going to utilize quite a bit of the sonorities that you saw in the previous slide, particularly the primary chord that you'll hear at both the beginning and the end of the work. You'll also hear some quotations, particularly you might catch America toward the end. That's America, the patriotic tune, not America from West Side Story. So just to clarify. So don't think that you're going to hear, Bernstein or anything. All right, so without further ado, the second performance of Charles Ives' quarter tone chorale transcribed for brass ensemble. No need to tune, Charlie. system that he's created, a new tonal system, if you will, and playing around with it, and in particular, trying to take melodies that are somewhat familiar to us and grapple with them and put them into his particular system. So I'm just going to talk briefly about the usage of these pitches in jazz improvisation in terms of being kind of an extension of the ornamentation idea. So I provided two examples given a particular harmony over the bar. You can see how, as a passing tone between two members of the same harmony, this quarter tone can be used, or bridging the gap between two pitches within two different harmonies. And again, this is something that Don Ellis was very huge into, and why he loved utilizing that lovely little fourth valve to access these passing tones and neighbor tones to elaborate on his jazz improvisation ideas. But Don Ellis is primarily known in the microtonal jazz world, as small as it is, for his innovations regarding the concept of the blues scale. So here we have our standard basic G blues, kind of getting that back into your ear, if you will. Okay, so that is the scale that when we're in a blues tune that's in G, we're told, hey, if you just improvise in these notes, you should be fine. Then you get this, which is the typical, in a 12-bar blues progression, this is the first chord that you see, is the tonic chord, but it's a dominant 7. So we have the major chord plus the minor 7. G, B, D, and F. And so one of the conundrums that Don Ellis tried to kind of wrestle with is, okay, so if we're going to say that this pitch in the blues scale works, but this is the first harmony we get, which contains this pitch, what do we have to say about that? Now, of course, there are plenty of answers that can be given about how, you know, jazz and to some degree all of Western music is a treatise on consonance versus dissonance and that sort of thing. But Don Ellis, being one to compromise, said, well, why don't we just use a pitch that's in between these two? And so he explored constructing a blues scale that will use what's called the neutral third. In other words, an interval of a third that is the quarter tone in between the major third and the minor third. And so his blues scale is an attempt, particularly via this pitch, to reconcile these conflicting ideas. Now, these other pitches are kind of elaborations and extensions on his idea of improvising via passing tones between chords that you see in the standard blues progression. But this right here is where it's at, this little third here. This is also often called a blue note, if you will. So where, you know, the listener hears it and there's an effect, an affect, if you will, that is generated by hearing this pitch because it is so out of the realm of what's going on otherwise. Another interesting tidbit is that if you listen to recordings of spirituals, particularly if you can find LP recordings, that these are particularly prevalent, you will hear in spiritual church choirs that sing traditional spirituals, you'll often hear this note appearing. Again, it's kind of an approximation between these two systems. And this particular scale, the bottom note here, so that's the sound that that scale has. As I mentioned before, Ellis published a method book of sorts for quarter tone performance on the trumpet, which he suggested could be modified for other instruments. And in the back are several etudes that use many of the scales that he has constructed using his basic scale that I showed you earlier. And this particular etude uses the blues scale. And so the style as listed on the etude, is slowly with a blues feeling, and then he puts it in 5/4. So it's a 5/4 blues feeling that has some blue notes in it. So please enjoy Don Ellis's Slowly with a Blues Feeling etude. Is the idea of expanded atonality. And typically speaking, and my dissertation committee and I actually had a bit of an extended discussion on this, but in terms of the interaction I've had with people, this is the context that most people assume microtonal music falls under. Just this idea of there's a bunch of notes and they use frequencies that we're just not accustomed to. And so there's not really a hierarchy of any kind. But you've now seen 4 previous contexts in which there's a clear purpose to these microtonal pitches, in which some sort of hierarchy does come into play. And so this is its own separate category in which we take the idea of atonality and we kind of just add more microtonal pitch to that. So in terms of the difference from expanded tonality, remember, if you've talked about atonality in your theory classes, you know that one of the main ideas is that in atonality, there is really no hierarchy. No pitch is really of greater importance than any other pitch. And there's really not, though again there can be exceptions to this, there's really not a central pitch, scale, or harmony, if you will. There might be a central intervallic pattern, but again, it's not related to some sort of hierarchy. And then in terms of differing from the ornamentation we talked about earlier, in expanded atonality, the quarter tone pitches are used just as regularly as non-quarter tonal pitches. In other words, I don't want to use the analogy of throwing a dart at a dartboard and writing that note down, but I mean there's just as much prevalence of both, the quarter tone and the non-quarter tone. And then the quarter tone pitches can often be used to end phrases and can begin or end whole pieces. And so this is actually a relatively small category in terms of compositional output in the realm of microtonal music. Most of what you'll see falls in one of those other categories, particularly in the idea of simulating non-Western music systems and the idea of expanded tonality, because the composer has some sort of rules that he or she is playing around with in terms of making this work. So I actually had to really dig to find an example of expanded atonality that would work for the book. And I actually had to borrow this particular etude. Ronald Caravan wrote Contemporary Techniques book for both saxophone and clarinet. And this etude actually comes from his saxophone Contemporary Techniques book. So the saxophone in particular is another instrument that uses microtones and quarter tones especially quite frequently in part because their repertoire has been established mostly throughout the last 50 to 100 years. And so the idea of microtones already being on the compositional table, if you will, has already been quite prevalent. So here is from Ronald Caravan's saxophone contemporary techniques book. This is his third quarter trumpet etude. That to me, I mean, it's beautiful music, but there's definitely a sense that all the pitches are represented pretty much equally in that. So that basically is what took me through the book, was presenting these 5 contexts, some etude examples of each, and then kind of being like, all right, now go out and proclaim microtonality to all your trombone players, or something like that. So now I'm kind of, what do I do next? Now that the book is done, my plan is to get it published, hopefully. We'll see. But my next step is to expand this general format to create books for other orchestral instruments to do this. One thing that one of my committee members said to me is, are you going to discuss in your book how easy it is for the trombone to be able to do this? And I said, no, because I want to take the format that I've established in the book that I've just created and then transfer it over to any other instrument. Now, obviously, I'm going to have to talk about the techniques that the saxophone or the trumpet or the guitar are going to have to do to get these pitches to happen. But that will just require a few extra examples. But the general content in the back 3/4 of the book will be the same. Here's the context, this is how we apply it, and here's a CD that has some random funky pitch bends in it. Okay? So that's kind of my plan with that. And then I already, it's probably a surprise to me, but I already have quite a few theory and ear training exercises generated for quarter tonal music. And so my plan eventually is to create sort of a workbook series that kind of allows people to wrap their ears and their analytical techniques around this sort of thing. I've already commissioned a few works that have contained quarter tonal music and been very satisfied with the results, but I feel like this is an important next step. If I believe that this is an important aspect of contemporary music, then I need to be promoting it by encouraging composers to utilize this. And research is never done. I came to Michigan State thinking, oh, I'm a microphone guy. Like I've got this down. I know all the stuff there is to know about this. And then I started this book, and I thought, oh crap, I don't. So just continuing research and exploration of this particular material and networking with people. Believe it or not, there's more than one microtonal organization out there that basically spends all their days on Facebook and other social media, tweeting and talking and hashtagging about microtones. So networking is always a good thing. And then what has been invaluable in this process is the feedback that I've gotten, particularly from, as I mentioned before, the other 3 people on stage, who really, up after my committee, are the next people I need to thank for getting this book done. Because just they have been very supportive And the dialogue has just been really meaningful in terms of how do I make this book not all in my head where I can understand it? How do I get it so that someone who didn't know anything about quarter tones when we're picking up this book could go through the 30 pages and really become much more proficient in this particular music. And so before we play this last lovely little ditty, there's a few thank yous that I need to make. Again, these guys who not only collaborated on helping me finish the book, but spent extra time preparing this last piece for you, which I'll talk about in just a second. Even though none of them are here, I'd like to thank the members of my dissertation committee, Professor Ava Ordman, Dr. Kevin Sedetal, Dr. Kevin Bardick, and Dr. Lee Van Handel, whose input was also very crucial in terms of getting this accessible to the musical layperson. Lastly, this being the last requirement, officially, of my DMA degree, I need to thank my family, who is represented today by my mom and my dad, who have always just kind of, yep, okay, you talk about quarter tones, you do that. Okay. And I've always kind of been supportive and understanding, and not just for that, but for the fact that I've been going to school for a decade now. Old jokes, I don't want and so just the support that they have shown has been just outstanding. And in terms of family, I'm very lucky to have had a supportive family here, represented in a variety of ways through organizations that I've been very fortunate to be a part of during my time here. And so your presence here today means a great deal to me, and I thank you. That being said, there's only one more song to sing, or tune to do, or what have you. And this lovely little gem I found during my master's. And it really is an interesting piece. Even though it says 5 movements, they're all really short, so don't think you're going to be here for another half hour. You won't be. But what's very interesting to me about this piece is that it really plays with your notions of what is consonant and dissonant. You're going to hear in the first movement several moments in which it's like, oh my goodness, what is happening? And then a beautiful major triad just emerges from the scene. And all of a sudden the first movement ends in this gorgeous C major chord. And throughout the piece you're going to see this idea of playing around with the major triad using quarter tonal and non-quarter tonal pitches, until finally in the end we result in a beautiful major triad built on F quarter sharp major. And so it is my hope that as the piece transforms the notion of consonance and dissonance, particularly as it's related to quarter tonal music, that this experience today has at least transformed a little bit your idea of what this music is, what it could be, and what it offers to us as a melodic and harmonic language. And so we'll get set up and we will perform for you Alois Hába's Suite for 4 quarter tone, 4 trombone and quarter tonal system. Thank you for coming.